Hi, it's Zoya again. Welcome to the second episode of the Incisive podcast. Again, we have with us Dr. Abhishek Juneja, the founder of Incisive. Today, we're going to discuss topics beyond education and let's get into it. So, I would like to know, sir, that with films and news and even our feeds shaped by these hidden agendas, do you think propaganda has stopped being just a state tool and become a part of our everyday lives?
Absolutely, Zoya. In fact, more than any other industry, it's the educational sector, the educational industry, or what Adorno termed as the culture industry, that has worked covertly towards spreading the state corporate agenda, right? And I refuse to look at the word propaganda in a negative light for the same reason. Because when you're surrounded by all these machinations, the state, the corporations, even spaces that you would otherwise associated with progressiveness, literature festivals, and creative events, or let's say something as interesting as Rechta, for example, I think there is a covert agenda behind a lot of these spaces. I can recall a quote by Chomsky where he says that the entire agenda of liberal education is that it reduces the spectrum of debate to this very, very narrow band, and all debates happen within that narrow band, and it gives the impression to the participant that he's engaging in all kinds of dissenting um, uh, uh, dissenting thoughts. But the truth is that just as how consent is manufactured, dissent too is manufactured and disciplined by these centers of propaganda, both overt and covert. So the state does it through different mediums, like for the recent example of the curriculum, eighth standard books being tampered with. That's the most obvious and the visible way in which the state does it. But the fact that let's say I let me recall a question that came in civil services exam about a decade ago when I was still writing exams, and it said that it was a mains question, a GS2 question, if I remember correctly, and he said that uh, tell us why the sex ratio among scheduled tribes is better than the sex ratio among scheduled castes, right? And you had to explain why this phenomenon existed. And the fact that, one, there are very few studies that focus on this, and two, because it has been presented as a question, it has to be taken as correct. you know it gets accepted as the truth, by virtue of it being a question being asked by the civil services exam. The state has managed to put this agenda of pitting scheduled castes against scheduled tribes. They're not saying what is the difference between the sex ratio of the caste community and the tribal communities. You've put one particular section of castes, the scheduled castes, against the scheduled tribes. And not just the syllabus, but a lot of other things associated with education, the activities we do. Every now and then we see that the government is celebrating a particular policy, huh? Azadi ka Amrit Mahotsav, and universities are compelled to celebrate those events and making them a part of their calendars. These are all small proofs of the fact that agenda is everywhere, and so there's no other way to fight this propaganda other than unleashing a counter propaganda. And uh, you can't really just criticize the existing propaganda by canceling them or only questioning them, right? You have to create a framework through which you can produce a counter propaganda, which not only just takes into account what is wrong with the system, but provides for an alternative, which is somewhere I think the educational spaces, especially spaces like the coaching centers, are missing, right? You may associate coaching centers with filling gaps, but what I think they've done is only deepen the crisis. They don't close the gaps. They're the same people teaching in coaching centers as the ones in universities. The curriculum, the pedagogy is the same. Just it's a matter of magnitude. So if you're working on magnitude 3 in college, the level of seriousness is 8 or 9 at a coaching center. But are you taught to question anybody? Are you taught to unpack these propagandas? No, I can't think of any. I'm talking about the most popular coaching centers, the ones who get shared around even by common people, the Vikas Divyakirtis and Khan Sirs of India. I don't think they have it in them to really question authority and this propaganda. They all do it within that spectrum, that very narrow spectrum that Chomsky talks about.
I would like to know that how do you think propaganda is being indirectly inflicted in spheres like cinema and media and our Instagram feeds, whatever?
See, so I think there are two kinds of spaces that exist. One is the mainstream, and which is, of course, largely corporate driven, right wing. And then there are those small spaces, let's say, comprising 10-20% of the population, the liberal spaces, the so called progressive spaces. Let's say on Instagram, uh, there are lots of feminists and Ambedkarites and generally liberals who question state policies and so on. But again, within a very narrow framework, you know. So to counter something like animal, you have to produce lapata ladies, right? Or to let's say question uh, the Kashmir files or the Kerala story, right? You have to produce an Udham Singh, you know. So it's not possible to answer a question beyond that spectrum, that is entailed in the question. Every question sets a boundary, a limit, and the answer cannot go beyond that particular thing, right? And so covert propagandas are often accepted as liberal progressive answers to propagandas, so in that sense, Instagram feeds like you're talking about, or films, a lot of media, uh, even the alternate spaces, and I am not including all of them. There are some of them are doing incredible job, uh, but even the alternative spaces that have emerged in the last decade, in terms of films or in terms of media channels, a lot of them carry the same institutional bias, class bias, that was contained originally in the canon, the which is now in the hands of the right wing and the corporations, right? So propaganda uh, does not really have uh, uh, doesn't need to have tentacles, those eight arms of octopus. Sometimes it can just wriggle into your system like a tapeworm into your stomach, and suddenly the next thing you know is you are parroting the same propaganda, that freedom is to go wherever I want to, and to so if you've limited the question of freedom to voting, to clothes, to market, then you've basically forgotten the basic premise of the question of freedom and liberty, right? So what propaganda really does is clip the wings, you know cut the question round the corners and make it amenable, so that powerful people can manage it. And this managerialism comes primarily from education centers. They teach you to manage, to live with, to adjust, uh, something's called a discipline for a reason. They are essentially disciplining you. And I am not a fan of Foucault. So I don't think we can understand these things from the Foucauldian lens alone. But it is true to some extent that there are, like Althusser said, ideological state apparatuses, and films are included in it, and Instagram reels. And so I fear the progressive liberal sometimes more than I fear the corporate right wing.
Also, what do you have to say about this nationalist and religious propagandas in cinema? We can see it in movies of Karan Johar and Rohit Shetty and all these war and action movies, how do you think they're affecting the society and the youth for that matter?
Uh, it's not rocket science, it's the market at work. Karan Johar identifies the NRI people as his audience, so he has to sell it to them. So the national anthem has to play in his movies, not as part of the package that the censor board brings, but as part of the script. And real censorship is where the censor board doesn't have to apply scissors on you. You've internalized, your writer, your editor, your songwriter have internalized that censorship, and you're not even capable of writing anything useful anymore. And to that extent, I think uh, what you would associate with the parallel cinema space also has had its wings clipped over the last few decades. And I don't think the Anurag Kashyap's or the Meghna Gulzars or they are capable of really challenging the agenda. Of course, there may be some films being made by FTI and SRFTI students, but they don't really reach common audiences such as us. And I can't go around hopping one film festival to another to find that kind of cinema. But effectively, it's the alternative spaces that have been neutered, and it doesn't really have to be as visible as buying the majority stake in indie TV. It can be something far simpler. Something that um, works without signal. You don't have to signal anymore. That's where I recall the word that the court used for the Ashoka University professor. He said dog whistle. You know, dog whistle. So I think the state has mastered the art of dog whistling. The corporations are the ones who got there through dog whistle. So it's probably a language we don't understand, right? Yeah.
And how, as in, can you relate this to incisive and unlearning for that matter? Propaganda as a tool.
Um, I wouldn't say incisive is a propaganda space, you know, because the first job is to just unpack everything, you know. I don't mind a religious minded person sitting in the class sharing his opinions or her opinions. Uh, the question is, are we able to create a space where that person becomes open to dialogue? The person doesn't feel sheltered by the larger political climate of the country, where he thinks he can get away with anything because the political climate of the country is such or the world is such. So to create that space is very important. You can't really start indoctrinating people on Marx or on Ambedkar or Martin Luther King Jr. for that matter, on grounds that are so infertile, and so um, bereft of any possibility of dissent, that I think initially the fact that I decided to teach everything, I think that's the first step. If you're only teaching one thing and you're saying it's only for one exam, that's where we've lost it. Learning one thing for one exam, it's the same as the danger of a single story, that proverb, right? That single stories are to be feared because they somehow manage to take the entire uh, spectrum of discourse, right? So they become the definitive voice of a person or a region. That's true for knowledge also. Looking at the world from one discipline or for one exam is certainly uh, regressive. So we're not doing propaganda. What we are doing is, if you say that something existed in ancient India, right, it needs to be verified within the rules of science, right? You can't say that something defied gravity or something defied the laws of motion, and after that point I will not care for your faith, for your belief system. And it is this element of not considering anything sacred except truth, except those two or three values which are also enshrined in the constitution, which is equality and liberty and justice. Only those can be held sacred, again with moderation within certain limits. But you can't really start propaganda in the kind of world we live in right now, right? Because one, of course, we know what can happen to people who talk in those terms, and second, we're not ready for it yet. To be really really clear, because if uh, an emergency like COVID could not bring out these inequalities and this inaccessibilities, these iniquities, then what will a classroom in Dehradun or a man like me do? Because that was a time when the whole world was ravaged, not just by a virus, but state excesses and corporate manipulation of every kind. And we have no account of it. Any professor, any researcher who has not taken into account the post COVID world in terms of how unequal it has become is not doing his discipline or her discipline any service, or the larger goal of knowledge and learning any service at all. Because if it's an event that has just passed you by as a health catastrophe, then as a social scientist, you've completely failed to get to the bottom of it.
You've talked about the eighth grade textbooks, right? So, do you think, as in, how do you think the education system and students, like, curating them into some beings of the society, as in, is this space being used as a space where you can play propaganda as a tool?
Uh, I'm not entirely sure how to answer that, but uh, see, the curriculum is just one aspect of things. If I have to strike a conversation on Babur or Akbar or Shivaji, my job as a teacher is not to tell you what they did alone. You know, the political action or the religious action that they undertook is not the key to understanding Aurangzeb or the key to understanding Shivaji. You know, like for example, when we talk about people, you know, when we talk about understanding the society, we don't understand individuals. We have to look at the interconnections, the subjectivities, and the intersubjectivities. Likewise, to understand Aurangzeb and Shivaji, I need to look at all other variables that existed then, some other constants that existed then, and there needs to be some corroborative history. I cannot rely on one source. I cannot rely on somebody's faith. So it's perfectly fine to reignite the debate on Aurangzeb and Shivaji, but not when the state is in support of one particular perspective. You know, history is not somebody's revenge on somebody else. You can keep saying that history is written by the victor or history is written by the man. If you really are a historian, I think it's a very simple job. You have to get as closer to truth as possible. You know, and I cannot have any preconceived ideas on what the truth really is. You can't say that because something has been in the syllabus for so long, it is essentially right or wrong. You know, that's how it works in science, right? That's how falsifiability works, right? That's what Popper said, that my job is to be open to being disproved. You know, a theory or any idea does not get validated through its proof, but the possibility of its being proved wrong. So if you've closed yourself to the possibility of being proved wrong, then I don't see any point in undertaking any exercise in social science or humanities, because we are dealing with people and we are dealing with double hermeneutics, unlike the sciences, right? Here, the object of our study is changing with time because of us studying them, you know, and it's constantly in a flux, and state and corporations have control over this change in flux. So, the narrative is one thing, but I want everybody to understand that neither narrative nor discourse can ever replace the vitality of truth, and which is why I differ with all these post structuralists and postmodernists, and why I still think that there's space for seeking that truth, whether it's in science or the other spheres.
Also, is there a thing called counter propaganda? And if yes, is it justified?
It really depends on who is doing that counter propaganda, because we've seen the US state interfere in the sovereign spaces across the world by arming the so-called counter government anti-state space to unleash their own propagandas. We've seen this in Thailand recently. We've seen this in Sri Lanka. We've seen this in Bangladesh. We've seen this all across the world. They've done this to South America ad nauseum, right? So it's not about whether there's a space. It's about what that space is and who is in control of that space. What are they armed with? You know, are they armed with the values of equality and freedom, or are they avenging, you know, something that they deem as untrue? And which is why unlearning is not an is not a separate exercise. Unlearning has to happen with learning. You can't separate the two, you know. And it doesn't happen in a linear way. It's not as if it's not even possible to unlearn everything that you've learned. The only possibility is of planting a seed of doubt, you know. And when I do that, when I plant a seed of doubt, in some sense I'm doing propaganda, right? So yeah. So and the larger question is something else. I think the larger question is, are we as people who love to use the word community, and I don't think we have a community, because socializing and sharing the social spaces or participating in events, that's the buzzword, right? Doing events together, that really is no answer to what is happening around the world, you know. I can do a fundraising event for Gaza, but that doesn't tackle the question of uh, the kind of fascist state uh, Israel has been, and the kind of fascism that US has been unleashing for years and years. And which is why, uh, for spaces like Incisive to thrive, you know, we just need to create a world that is receptive to new ideas that challenge their own, right? And I'm not a big fan of ideology, you know. Uh, if you're not armed with material reality, ideology won't take you anywhere. And a lot of uh, left minded people think that they can ideologize through propaganda. I don't think it's possible. You have to work with people, you have to talk to them, you don't have to talk at them. And that's a big problem as far as propagandas are concerned, you know. The state completely wiped out a whole belt of tribals this year while the whole Pulwama episode was unraveling, in the name of them targeting Maoists. I saw this when I was growing up and when I was in college. The state then, under a different government, had launched something called Salwa Judum. And we've come to that point now that not only are Maoists or tribals looked at with suspicion, they have become a term of ridicule, of abuse. You know, you can call anybody a Naxal or a Maoist and do whatever you please. Right? They've made it a synonym of terrorism. And it's funny because if Maoism is a term of abuse, the biggest power of the world right now was indoctrinated by Mao under the Maoist movement. And not only is it giving India and US a run for its money, it basically controls a lot of things that are happening in the world right now. And which is why we need to look at every term, of course, with skepticism. I'm not saying that anybody's word or my word should be taken without, you know, looking them up and reading more on them. But the fact that whatever the state says is sacrosanct, this needs to be just completely wiped out of our memories, you know. I don't want to use the term matrix. We're not in a matrix and somebody's controlling us. No, it's not as dramatic as that. But we do learn to love our prisons after a point. You know, we are in a world where we are taught in education, schools and colleges, to love this. People keep complaining about their 9 to 5 schedules and corporate lifestyles. Nobody quits. And they all plan to retire early and do what? You know, do is there a solution to all of that? So yeah, I think I may have answered the question.
Also, let's talk about Dehradun. It's cultural and religious and especially political run currently. As in, how do you think has it evolved, and has it evolved for the good or for the worse?
I've been here on and off since 2002. I've spent about a decade here on and off. And I've spent a lot of time and energy trying to create spaces where conversations are possible. So I don't say this with any cynicism, but I say this with a lot of responsibility that um the age group between 18 and 30, or probably 40, is politically dead in this city. I'm not sure what the situation right now is in other tier 2, tier 3 cities, because I was in Cochin long ago and I haven't been in Delhi for a while. But I cannot think of any other city that gets talked about in terms of education as much as Dehradun, and yet labors under the mass ignorance that the city does. And over the years, of course, the last 3 years have been much worse in terms of this influx of people from all over, and we see crime against women has gone up, and we see that generally violence has shot up and so on. But even otherwise, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, the cultural elite of Dehradun, very much in the mold of the Gandhian and the Nehruvian elite, that likes to talk in English, go to cafes, have these soirees, musical evenings, literary evenings, Ruskin bonds, and so on. It's seeped in nostalgia, and nothing grates my bones as much as nostalgia does. They're all talking about a time when they were kids, they were all growing up, green hedges and lovely trees and lush green surroundings everywhere. And their entire grouse is you're cutting trees. It's as if their houses were made on spaces that were deserts. Right? What kind of a solution is this, that new houses should not come up because that they would require cutting trees?
Which is a convenient
Of course, it's the most convenient position to take as an environmentalist. And Dehradun is full of environmentalists. I think if I throw a stone right now, it'll hit two of them in my locality. There are more NGOs on environment than there are trees probably in Dehradun. Right? So the problem is that we've all taken a very convenient step. Uh, let's avoid plastic straws. Let's go for bamboo toothbrushes.
use metal based.
Yeah, metal based things. Yeah, let's not have plastic. Let's boycott this. Anybody, a ready wala who gives his sabzi in plastic, let's boycott him. You are somebody whose carbon footprint includes 10 packets of kurkure every week, as if kurkure is carried around in paper, right? So this is the extent of environmentalism. Let's have a cleanliness drive. Sundays को हम जाएंगे और माल देवता के जंगल साफ करेंगे. There is no class consciousness. You know, a very famous environmentalist said, environmentalism without class consciousness is gardening. There's no difference between gardening and environmentalism in Dehradun. Basically, the people running these NGOs are gardeners. They just hate the fact that there's filth in front of their houses. That's what they really mind. So, and it's also convenient because religion comes and takes a very unique space within this environmental movement. They'll associate gods and goddesses with all this. Namami Gange project. So now you don't have to clean Ganga but also worship Ganga. The High Court of Uttarakhand went as far as declaring Ganga and Yamuna as legal entities. So now we have Ganga and Yamuna as gods and legal entities. They are everything except rivers. And the point is that unless you have a clear understanding of who really is violating the environment, that it has resulted in this, the corporations, the large corporations, we have no understanding of this. We continue buying our products from those corporations, endorsing them, not standing up to them. So this space, and this is, you brought up environmentalism, but this is true for the literary sphere, the cultural sphere. So if you see the government doing something on Sanskrit and Hindi, people here will start talking about Garhwali and Kumauni and English. So it's always a convenient stand. You will never go beyond the first line of attack, because see, I think, to cut the long story short, the thing is as simple as this: if your activism or if your dissent is not coming at a cost, it's not coming at a heavy price, there's something wrong with it. There's something misplaced with it. If you're doing something really useful, you have to pay a price for it. And if you're not having to pay a price for it, there's something wrong. And if you're being encouraged for it, if somebody's patting your back for it, huh? Like the famous quote goes, huh? वो जिनकी पीठ थपथपाते हैं उनकी रीढ़ की हड्डी गायब हो जाती है. Dhumil says that, and it's the same. A lot of these activists are being awarded by the government. There's nothing funnier than being a professor or a writer or an environmentalist being awarded by corporations and the state. Yeah,
Also, this might sound a bit controversial, but these awards are also being purchased.
that's the least controversial thing about the award.
Hmm.
That's the part that's out in the open now.
Yeah. So, well, this was an extremely propaganda stricken conversation, mostly. And I'm so glad that we did this. And I'm glad we delved into much more. And I hope we can get back together some other time and talk about something more intense and interesting, hopefully.
Right. Thanks for bringing this up, Zoya, and I hope that we can go beyond the binaries of uh, pro-state, anti-state, and pro-religion, anti-religion, and pro-corporate, anti-corporate. Because the more you divide uh, things in such clear ways, the cleaner these breaks are, the cleaner these boundaries are, the more difficult the space is going to be. And just for example, just look at the map of Africa. Uh, it's the most poverty stricken and the most, uh, you know, probably the worst place to be on earth. And it's a place full of straight boundary lines. There aren't as many straight boundary lines anywhere else on earth than in Africa. So, cutting things in using scales and clear lines is problematic, whether it is with opinions or with, uh, you know, regions. Thanks for having me.